Hi Gators, and welcome to material for Psych 200. This first lecture is on the introduction to psychology and the history of psychology. Each of these mini lectures is going to start with our learning objectives. An important thing that we'll also start with most of the time are definitions. So a definition we have to start with is, what is psychology? What are we talking about in this class? Psychology is the scientific study of the mind and of behavior. It comes from the Greek psyche, meaning soul, and really an important part of this definition is not only that we study the mind and behavior, but that it's scientific study of the mind and behavior. So it's not just people sitting around in a room contemplating, what is the mind? What is the mind? It actually relies on scientific method. So we have to be able to use those same principles that you would use in any other science class to be able to understand the mind and behavior. Why study psychology? So studying psychology is not going to let you read people's minds. It's not going to, be all about counseling or psych disorders. Studying psychology is very broad. Reasons why you might study this are very broad. So it's going to give you a lot of skills or help to strengthen those skills that you already have. Things like critical thinking, recognizing your own internal biases. That comes from psychology. Or that's information that we get from psychology, from the psychological perspective, quite often. Using logic, making observations, asking good questions that let us make strong observations, communicating well, and just understanding behavior and thoughts. So if you just see somebody and you're like, why are you doing that? Just why? Psychology can help us to understand those times and those questions where we just really don't know what other people are thinking or why they're doing a certain behavior. So psychology can help us a lot, many different ways. The origins of psychology, we say that psychology has a long past but a short history. So we have a long past because we can trace our roots way back into philosophy. So this big debate of, are people products of their nature? Is it something they're born with that makes us who we are? Or products of nurture, so what we receive from our environment. So if you have somebody who is diagnosed with schizophrenia, that'd be something we would want to understand. Is it something they were born with, or is it a product of their environment? Well, most of the time now we say it's a mixture of both. So it's not just nature or just nurture. Most things are both. We also have a history in biology and in physiology, but it really wasn't until the late 1800s when psychology became its own discipline. So it's, got this long past we can trace way back, but a really short history for a science. We also call psychology a social science because we're influenced by other people. What we're going to spend some time on now are our founders. So we have to talk about those people who really helped psychology get off the ground and become a field. So the founders of psychology, if you just ask people on the street, who founded psychology? Who do you think? Most of the time you're going to get Sigmund Freud. But psychologists actually don't trace their history just to Sigmund Freud. So who we call the first psychologist is Wilhelm Wundt. So that's our first psychologist. And then William James is also a really important player. So these two men were extremely important in the development of psychology. So Wundt was somebody who actually wrote, the first textbook, opened the first lab. He did that in 1879. He studied things like conscious experience. So he wanted people to introspect, or these are trained people, to introspect, to think about their sensations and feelings during certain specific stimuli. He also studied things like reaction times, which you can test your reaction time there, but we often think about that in terms of driving. If a little beach ball goes in front of your car, how quickly can you stop? That's your reaction time. So he studied things like that as well as introspection. So this is kind of a brief example of introspection. We're not trained participants, so we would not be actually doing this study. But this is kind of a brief example, kind of let you know what this might look like. So we might show his participants a picture like this. So this picture you can see here is of garbage. And then he'd ask, to report sensations, thoughts, feelings when viewing this photograph. So if you view this, think about your own sensations and feelings. How do what do you think about? What do you feel? So one of the big issues with this, obviously, is that I can't tell you you're wrong in any of your thoughts and feelings. I can't know for sure that what you report is the actual truth. So it's very subjective. And you try to get away from this subjectivity by training participants and things like that, but still it's subjective. So if you say, that looks like a big mound of treasure to me, I might think, oh, it looks disgusting. But I can't tell you, you're wrong. You can't tell me I'm wrong. It's subjective. So we needed someone like William James to come in and help us to kind of move beyond just simple introspection. So William James was really influenced by Darwin's work, and he thought psychology should study the function of behavior. So he said, if you see someone doing a behavior, there's got to be a function. There's got to be some reason why they're doing it. So if you are, binge eating, there's some function for that binge eating. There's a reason you're doing it. So William James would say, let's study that. And he would want to study this more with some of those objective measures. So obviously they were relatively crude compared to what we have now, but still he was trying to use objectivity to include this in psychology. So William James, is just got this little love emoji there because he is amazing. So many things that we do now are tracked back to William James. He was a really, really amazing founder for psychology. Here's our boy Freud. So Freud was actually a neurologist. He studied patients with hysteria, but he really got psychology off the ground in many ways. So for most people, if you ask them who's a psychologist, you get Freud. Or who started psychology, you get Freud. So he was somebody who really riled people up. He had a lot of interesting ideas, controversial ideas. He believed in the unconscious mind, so this idea that we're not fully conscious or fully aware of everything that drives our behavior. He really focused on those childhood experiences, so what happened to you when you were younger that dictated how you act today. And then he incorporated things like analyzing dreams, having people just speak off the tongue, which is free association, and then studied those times, we called them Freudian slips, where he said your unconscious mind just came out. So a good quote for that is, if it's not one thing, it's your mother. So it's kind of saying that your mother might slip out of that and should be on your unconscious mind. So you probably have seen examples of that, and we'll cover examples of that in the class too. His perspectives really dominated psychology for decades, and a lot of people are not so sure about Freud. A lot of people find his work very controversial, which we'll get more into as the course goes on. But there's an important quote about this, which is, if we have seen further, it's on the shoulders of giants. So sometimes, Sigmund Freud may have just made people angry with some of the stuff he said, and that made them do more research to prove him wrong, which then furthered the field of psychology. So sometimes, just having that person who is controversial will help to stimulate the field. Gestalt psychology is something that didn't really catch on as much in America, but what they're looking at is the whole. So they say, it's not the little individual parts that we perceive, it's the whole. And you can see some examples of this here, like with this panda bear. It's not actually a fully complete panda bear, but that's how we perceive it. So there's no lines in the back, there's no line finishing the head, but we don't perceive just random black dots, we perceive the entire picture. So this is something that is really influential then in sensation and perception research. So the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So we're continuing along on our founding kind of fathers and, founding mostly fathers here, but there are some founding mothers. But we're kind of continuing that with behaviorism. So with behaviorism, we had individuals, or this group of psychologists, who really wanted to say, or really said, we can't study the mind. So I can't know what's going on up here in my mind, in your mind. So what I need to study is behavior. So I want to observe what you actually do and try to control what you actually do. So this was the behaviorism movement. It was really, really big for a long time, especially in American psychology. So they would study learned behaviors, which are very, very broad. It's not just what you learn in school. It's super broad. And they would rely a lot on animal research, and we'll talk about some of these main founders of behaviorism really quickly. So you probably heard of Ivan Pavlov. The name might ring a bell, but Ivan Pavlov was actually a physiologist. He did research on dogs, and he found, which we'll talk about more in depth as the class goes on, but that he could train dogs to salivate to a bell. So they would learn, when I hear a bell, ding, 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 that I'm going to eat soon. And this would be a learned association. So he called this association classical conditioning. So these are behaviors that are not really under our control. They're more automatic types of behaviors. But we learn those associations. So if you've ever, had a lover and they wore a certain perfume, and then you break up, don't see them for a while, but you step in an elevator and someone else is wearing that perfume, and you have that feeling like, or maybe, oh, depending on how the relationship ended. But still, you get that feeling from that association with that certain smell that reminds you of a certain person. That's classical conditioning. So there's so many examples of this, and we'll go into this quite a bit as we continue the course. John Watson was another behaviorist. He was an American psychologist, and he really focused on that observable behavior. I really like this quote to show you what kind of person John Watson is. But he kind of said if you give him a dozen babies, which thankfully nobody ever did give him a dozen babies, but he kind of said if you give me these dozen babies, I can make them be anything I want. So it doesn't matter about their talents, their penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, or background of the ancestors. I'll just make them be whatever I want. So if you give me a baby, I'll make him a doctor, I'll make him a lawyer, I'll make him a thief. So he was very, very much into this environment. The environment shapes who you are. So very, very interesting guy, John Watson. B.F. Skinner is someone who worked on operant conditioning. So he believed that these behaviors all have consequences. Any behavior you do is going to have a consequence. So he thought that these consequences are shaped then by whether you're reinforced for something. So, get some kind of more, pleasure, more likely to perform that behavior for some reason, or punished for a behavior. And he studied this often using animals in what we call a Skinner box. So he would have them, maybe the rat push a lever, and they might get a little hint of sugar water or cocaine. And that would be a reinforcer for them. They'd be like, ooh, delicious. And you'd see them start then pressing the button more often. Or they might get a little shock. That's a punishment. We don't like shock. So they would stop pushing that button. So that's kind of how Skinner would do his work. But we'll talk a lot more about these people in depth as the course goes on. We're getting there in our founders. Humanism is something that's really, really common now in counseling types of psychology. They really emphasize that potential for good. So they kind of got tired of Freud's perspective and behaviorism, which almost had a negative or pessimistic view of humanity, and said, we think there's potential for good that's innate in all humans. And we'll talk about some of the practitioners, first one being Maslow. So you've probably heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He developed this hierarchy that kind of said we have to fulfill these base needs, like our needs for food and water and physical safety, and then we can move up and belong with others, have self-esteem, and eventually become the person that we're meant to be. So this was kind of this perspective that really showed, that we need to kind of meet those base needs in order to move up. Carl Rogers is a humanist that many people who end up doing counseling or clinical psychology end up really relating to and following this perspective. But Carl Rogers believed that good is within all people. He was a humanist. And he kind of forwarded this idea of client-centered psychotherapy. So it's not a patient, it's a client. And what this kind of means is that the person is capable, they're not a patient, they're capable of meeting their own needs, of figuring out their own problems. But he would help them do that by modeling certain things. Unconditional positive regard. He would view them as a person, as a human. He would review them as someone who is worthy of love, no matter what they did or said. You'd be very genuine with the person, so not wearing a mask, but just speaking one's true feelings, and would show them a great deal of empathy. So Carl Rogers is someone who, if you do end up studying counseling or clinical psych, you'll definitely review Carl Rogers. So kind of moving along in our history, the cognitive revolution, by the 1950s, we started having more of an interest again in that mental functioning. So instead of just behavior, actually saying, let's look at what's going on up here, up and upstairs. So Noam Chomsky is someone who's well known for this research. But this is kind of where we're at today. So we see, a lot of perspectives being incorporated from all of these different things. Behavioral. People who study behavior, people who study cognition, just tons of different amazing diversity. And speaking of diversity, multicultural psychology is a field that's getting a lot more, important, really, really, it's so important, but it's getting a lot more, what's the word I'm thinking of? I had to pause and think of my words. But it's getting a lot more attention, which is excellent because it's very, very important. So multicultural psychologists will study group differences, and this is including groups as in culture, like individualistic cultures like the United States versus more collectivist cultures, some of places like China, more collectivist. Also incorporates ethnic or racial groups such as African American psychology, and then really will help us to avoid ethnocentrism. So that's the belief that one's own culture is somehow superior to the culture or backgrounds of others. And this is something that's really, really important to psychology because we do have a crisis of being weird. And so what we mean by that is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So almost all of our psychological samples, all of this research that we base this field on, comes from countries that are weird, people that are weird. So like the United States is a weird place. We don't represent the rest of the entire globe. And so it's very, very important in this multicultural psychology to incorporate other people, not just sophomores in psychology courses in the United States, which is what a lot of our research is based on. So this is a very, very important area. So contemporary psychology, we see things like biopsychology, evolutionary psychology, so trying to understand the mind and behavior from a biological standpoint or from an evolutionary standpoint. Things like sensation and perception, so anything you sense, with your senses or perceive with your mind, this is something people study now. So sensation is kind of bringing that in with your eyes, your touch, your nose, your smell. Anything that you can sense is that, sensory organ. And then perception is how you perceive it in the brain. So they're different. We saw that with that, dress that went popular a few summers ago. Where was it blue or black or white or gold? I don't know if you all remember that phenomenon, but everyone was like, oh no, is this dress blue and black? Is it white and gold? That was a perception thing. So, that's a really interesting field of study. Cognitive psychology is how we think, memory. So, many different aspects of that kind of mental processes falls under cognitive psychology. So me forgetting the word of importance or attention that I forgot just recently when talking about multicultural psych, that's something a cognitive psychologist would study. So why does that happen? Why do I just talk and then have a complete loss for words? That's something a cognitive psychologist would study. Developmental psychology is what I am. I'm a developmental psychologist, and so we study people across the lifespan as well as generational differences, so kind of growth from womb to tomb. Personality psych studies why, who we are, why we're that way, our traits, our patterns of behavior over time. Social psychology studies people in groups. Industrial organizational study is focused mostly in the workplace. Health psychology focuses on, the interaction between, the physiology, the psychology, and how it works to produce health, either in a good way or to damage health. Sport and exercise psych is all about how to incorporate psychological themes into physical performance. Clinical psychology helps people with psychological disorders or other issues that they're experiencing. And then forensic psych is psychology within the systems of law. There's many careers in psychology that you might be interested in. So with a bachelor's degree, we find people mostly in things like sales, social work, management. There are some important distinctions, though, that will kind of come as we continue through the course. So psychologist versus psychiatrist. A psychologist often has a PhD. A psychiatrist is an MD. They're a doctor, like a medical doctor. So another difference is a PhD versus a PsyD. So a PhD is more of a research-based degree. It's a doctorate of philosophy. So I have a PhD. People who want to study, more clinical aspects, more applied aspects, sometimes go for a PsyD. So those individuals often want to do private practice. So your book, the OpenStax text will go into that information if you want to read a little bit more about those distinctions. Well, Gators, that's it for this first introduction to psychology and going to be reviewing our history. Thanks.